The severity and significance of the euro crisis can hardly be underestimated. Still, I think it's important to remember that until now, the crisis has been about the peripheries of the European continent, about relatively small countries on the edges of Europe, countries such as Greece, Portugal, Spain or Ireland. In the coming year, however, the crisis will begin to affect Europe's bigger and key states, countries such as Italy, France, and of course Germany. Now, I'm not intending to say that the euro will collapse, nor does it necessarily mean, from my argument, that the crisis will continue. In fact, there are plenty of reasons for believing that 2013 will be the year when the euro crisis will conclude one way or another. What I'm arguing is that the positive and negative scenarios are evenly poised with a 50-50% chance either way, but that Europe's destiny will be written by the bigger states rather than the smaller ones, as has been the case until now. Now, it's easy to be gloomy about today's Europe. That, if you will, is the default position of many people when they talk about the old continent. So let me, just for the sake of being slightly original, offer instead a more positive spin. Number one, when the crisis erupted, people predicted that the Eurozone will crack up. Well, to date, it has not, and the worst may actually be behind us. Two, there was a widespread prediction that Germany will refuse to pay for the others. Well, of course, the Germans hummed and hawed about how much they were prepared to put up, but at the end of the day, they paid. Indeed, if all the current bailout funds end up still in bankruptcy, the German taxpayer may have to shell out a cool €500 billion in the credits that it has given. This has hardly been a stingy Germany. Three, expectations of a violent breakdown in law and order have never come to pass. There were plenty of demonstrations and plenty more disturbances may take place in places such as Greece. But the reality is that extremist fringe parties have remained on the fringes in Europe, and they're likely to stay there. If anything, the indicators are that voters are returning to the old traditional political parties that have dominated the scene in Europe since the end of the Second World War. So, as one looks into the future, there are also a few grounds for optimism. At long last, the European Central Bank has accepted, at least in principle, that it should buy the debt of some individual crisis-stricken countries. That has reassured investors and governments that there is a circuit breaker, there is a last-minute panic button that could be pressed in order to stop this crisis from escalating. Secondly, it's worth remembering that the Euro project was not about economics. It was always part of a deal designed to hide Germany's strength and France's weakness at the same time. And as such, it remains as important today as it was in 1992 when the Maastricht Treaty was signed. And Germany remains determined to sustain it. Three, the euro will not break up if a country like Greece or Portugal, for the sake of argument, decide to leave the current currency. The only way the euro can break up is if the Germans decide that they have had enough of this, and there's no indication of that happening. So while many countries may, in extremis, run the risk of being ejected from the currency zone or choose to leave it out of their own volition, the currency arrangement as such is likely to endure. Furthermore, mass sovereign debt defaults don't happen simply because governments can't pay their debts. If that was the case, then it would have happened very frequently because throughout history many governments were rarely able to service their debts. Instead, psychology plays an important part in such crises. When investors believe that governments can no longer pay, they run away. And it is possible that the investors who were spooked by Europe's debts will simply tire of the current panic, and that the crisis will be over that way. Finally, there may be the very tentative indication that Europe may be returning to economic growth. Now, if that is the case, then the old virtuous cycle may return, that the debts of the Europeans will become serviceable because their revenues from tax receipts will be greater. So, given this optimistic slant, you may wonder why I still say that the chance of success in Europe in the coming year are not better than 50-50. Well, the reasons for that, or if you want the less positive ledger, are as follows. First, expenditure cuts will have to become permanent. It's not that countries are tightening their belts for a particular reason at this moment and they could then afford to spend more. The way the European demography looks indicates that this will have to be a permanent feature of lower expenditure, and it would be imposed from above by treaties between European countries. Secondly, the problem of the euro is really just a tiny manifestation of a much bigger malaise. We're talking about a continent which is unable to provide full employment and is unable to halt a decline in its productivity level. Now, about a quarter of all Spaniards or Greeks are jobless. Overall, 10.4% of Europe's population, or a nation the equivalent of 23 million people in Europe, have no jobs at all. And if that was not enough, about half of the youngsters in countries such as Spain or Greece have never had a permanent employment. Now, undoubtedly, the financial crisis made all these figures worse, but the reality is that Europe's unemployment disease has been stubbornly there for decades. Even in the mid-2005, when the economy in Europe was booming, the EU jobless rate overall was only 1% lower than it is today. And more to the point is that it is impossible for Europe, it seems impossible for Europe to keep up in the level of competitiveness. So it's not globalization as such that has affected Europe, but the inability of the Europeans to adapt to it, which is at the root of the problem. And the failure begins with an education system which is poorly funded and tends to undervalue manufacturer skills, and it continues to a social welfare system that eats much more of resources than it puts back in, and has a perverse system of incentives which actually makes it cheaper on occasions for people not to work than to work, or more profitable for them personally. So this system cannot continue. If Europe emerges from the euro crisis, it will still have to dismantle the welfare state that was the pride of Europe, the one bit that separated Europe from the supposedly cutthroat market economies, heartless market economies of Asia or North America. That model, which was supremely European, supposedly uniquely European, will have to go. And most significantly, all these changes will have to take place with very little consultation with the public. All the systems that are put in place in the European Union are there to cut expenditure rather than keep it, and to do so without asking the population what they want. There is a deep and fundamental crisis of accountability in Europe, and this is likely to continue. Now, again, I would not suggest that as a result of this we face meltdown in Europe, but a lot of things will have to go right in 2013 for the outcome to be positive. Number one, France and Italy will actually have to deliver on the promises that they have made to cut their budget expenditure. And although a lot of Europeans have suffered a great deal, the reality is that no country that has been bailed out up to now has actually met the target that it has promised in return for a bailout. And it would be surprising if the French, who've just elected the president on a promise of not cutting expenditure, are somehow likely to achieve their own targets. But if they don't, then a country as big as Italy or France, which does not achieve the targets and continues to spend more than it can possibly raise at affordable rates, will mean a return, a very sharp return to the crisis straight away. Secondly, an election is due in Italy. We cannot go on with a supposedly technocratic government, and it remains to be seen whether this will produce a decisive outcome. We don't know when the election is likely to take place in 2013, but we do know that it has to take place probably in the first half of the year, and that the result is very much up in the air. Furthermore, elections will take place in Germany, the biggest country in the European Union and the bankroller of everyone else. Now, it is possible that we will end up with a government that will continue on the current policy. Current predictions indicate that German Chancellor Angela Merkel is likely to succeed, coming on top as a first, but probably having to rely on a broader coalition. However, if the issue of helping other countries in Europe becomes an acute electoral issue in the campaign, then it will be very difficult to predict how Germany is going to behave thereafter. There is the beginning of a popular uprising in Germany itself about the amount of money that they have to spend. And finally, the European Central Bank, the ECB, will actually have to make good on what up to now was a promise of buying the bonds of individual countries. The ECB believed that it could just make the statement, and that should be enough to keep the vultures at bay. Well, I don't believe so. I think the ECB will have to start putting hard cash up front to buy the bonds of places such as Spain and perhaps even Italy. It would be a unique experience which will be very difficult to predict in advance where it's going to go. My final points are that although it is possible to see a continent that survives more or less unscathed out of this crisis, and although the chances are very high that the crisis in one way or another would be resolved in 2013 without a political meltdown, the reality is that we're dealing with a European continent which will remain self-obsessed, unable to take any initiative on a global scene, unable to contribute to global prosperity, and at the same time apprehensive about the world outside. Europeans are apprehensive and wonder whether the Americans even care about them anymore. They're apprehensive and wonder about what the rise of China means to them, but they do not seem to come up with any idea about how they could contribute in shaping these global events in any way. It is a shame to end on a rather subdued note like that, but I owe it to the audience to at least be truthful on this point. Thank you.